Friends, good evening and welcome to session 3 of Living Flame of Love, an invitation to contemplative prayer with John of the Cross. I would like to begin this with a prayer of St. John of the Cross, so please join me. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. O blessed Jesus, grant me stillness of soul in Thee. Let Thy mighty calmness reign in me. Rule me, O Thou King of gentleness, King of peace. Give me control over my words, thoughts, and actions. From all irritability, want of meekness, want of gentleness, O dear Lord, deliver me. By Thine own deep patience, give me patience, stillness of soul in Thee. Make me in this and in all more and more like Thee. Amen. So today we are going to do a survey of the writings of John of the Cross, and of course it's impossible in an hour and 15 minutes to do an entire survey, but his principle works, and particularly the ones on which he has written a treatise or a commentary. There are 3 poems, but 4 works, and so we're trying to do a survey of the literature. But I have other material as well for us to take a look at, and we will do that today. Now, before we do this, let me make a few observations, a few points. So that as we embark on this journey, that we are not merely understanding John of the Cross, but perhaps what John of the Cross is really trying to do with the people that he guided, like all the people that he was giving spiritual direction to. And what he did centuries back, he's doing with us now. He's directing us in some way. Now, we are not trying to become John of the Cross. And I think I said this in my first session, and let me say that again, because you may have been a little overwhelmed with last week's session about contemplative prayer. I laid out various ways of praying, methods of praying, but I took you to a higher level of contemplative prayer, which was John of the Cross. And if you're understanding John of the Cross, we need to understand where he went, right? And it is possible that it was a little overwhelming. And so I did receive some feedback. One of them that I got was, I feel so inadequate. And that's why I'm trying to say that we're not trying to become John of the Cross. And the sense of inadequacy that you might feel, it's a good place to be, because it tells us of the ability of our humanity to realize a potential as God's beloved people. In other words, how high we can rise as human beings. John shows us the absolute height that the human person, every human person, has the potential to rise. Not everybody may, but that does not mean that we should not be on the journey. And in this journey, we are not trying to be like John of the Cross. We got to do it our way. But if you're feeling inadequate, it means that we have room to rise. And I hope we can do that. What does John teach us? So here is an exercise, an experiment, if you if you wish. And I did this with somebody the other day, okay? So I'm going to do that experiment with you on the screen just now. Of course, I can't see you, but I hope that you will do this with me. So for example, when I say your mind, what do you point to? And I'm assuming at this moment, you're saying that I'm pointing to my brain, right? And when I say your heart, where do you point to? I'm sure all of you are pointing here. Even those things that we feel deeply in our heart, we point here. And if I say your strength, where do you point to? The person that I did the experiment with pointed out to his arm. And then if I say your soul, where do you point to? And this is where John of the Cross comes to our aid. John teaches us to be in touch with that part of our being that we don't know where to point to. So think about the commandment that Jesus gives. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your strength, all your soul. Where is that soul? Even though we cannot point to that precise place when it comes to the soul, that soul is in me. That soul is me. And it is the only part of our being that is eternal. And John teaches us to become conscious of our soul and be sensitive to the life of the soul within us. Now, those of you who might be philosophically inclined, it might be good for me to say that really, John of the Cross follows the Platonic and the Augustinian philosophical and theological thought. Plato, for example, there is the lived reality, but there is this real world of ideas, right? And it's not an abstract world; it's a real world for him. For him, there is this duality of the mind, of the mind and the body, of the spirit and the body. The spirit, as it were, trapped in the body, and the spirit needs to rise above the physical. And so Augustine follows that trend of thought, and then John of the Cross follows that as well. So then John teaches us to become conscious of our soul and to be sensitive to the life of the soul within us. He teaches us that once we begin to pay attention to the life of the soul can rise to heights that we can never imagine. Now, this is not just in terms of our soul as Christians, but you know that there are people who tell us that as far as the human spiritual abilities are concerned, human beings use but a minuscule of what we are capable of. And so John teaches us to pay attention to what the soul is capable of. Not only that, John helps us to understand that the soul's ultimate desire is God, which is our ultimate desire even as sensual beings, isn't it? If I ask you, what is our destiny? We all want to go to heaven. Which is what? Complete union with God. And so the soul, which is the only part of us that is eternal, ultimately desires total union with God, but we can only pay attention to the soul by taking the time for silence and solitude. So that's the other feedback that I got from someone yesterday, that the 15 minutes that I recommended that we use any of the methods of prayer that John of the Cross and the Carmelites propose. Recollection was one of them. Divine presence was one of them. That even though they did not, get into it or feel it, they kept that time aside for solitude and silence. So really, then John is teaching us to pay attention to the life of the soul within us, the soul that is created by God and longs for God. The other thing that John teaches us is that there is another place from which to live life, right? And I'm going to give you a little example here. Now, I have had two friends of mine in the recent past who have had serious procedures for their heart replacement surgeries, really. And the problem that these two friends began to realize was they were getting breathless, right? You really didn't have the energy, you don't have the strength. You would feel that you were breathless. And so, of course, they had to meet the doctor, which is not a very pleasant experience all the time. They had to prepare themselves for whatever the doctor proposes, which is generally a surgery. Then they have the surgery, and then after the surgery, it's months of recuperation. Sometimes it takes 6 months to 8 months. One of my friends has just passed 8 months, and now she feels that finally she's getting back to how she should be feeling, right? But there's therapy, and therapy is not easy. You got to stay at it. You got to stick to it. It's not always the pleasantest thing. There are ups and downs all along. But then once you recover, once you begin to feel good, now you live life from a very different place. Now you pay attention to your diet. Now you make sure that you exercise, that you're living healthily. Honestly, these people are now living life from a different place. Now that analogy I can use for the soul. Inside us sometimes is a soul that cannot breathe because it cannot get to God in the way the soul is created to do. And nobody's paying attention. Because we can point to the mind, we can point to the heart, we can point to the strength, but we cannot point to the soul, so we often do not pay attention to the soul and what the soul is seeking to do within us. But this soul is our soul, as I said. This soul is me. And John invites us to give our soul the breath of God, the life of God. And you can give breath and life to the soul by helping the soul to rise higher above the senses. And it's not easy. It's like somebody recovering from a heart valve surgery. Do therapy. Therapy is this time of silence and solitude that we take to give the soul the attention that it deserves. And finally, prepare the soul for this total union with God, which John of the Cross would say is the consummated union with God. Right? So this is what we are trying to learn from John of the Cross. Don't try to be John of the Cross. Try to hear what he's saying to us. And I think I'm saying two things, which is that John is teaching us to get in touch with that part of our being that we don't know where to point to, but it is real within us, our soul. And then he's teaching us to live our lives from the perspective of the soul. To live our lives from a different place, not merely our senses, but our soul. So I wanted to say those two things about what we can learn from John of the Cross. And then I wanted to give one more a little perspective on romance and poetry, in the use of romance in religious poetry. Folks, I don't want us to get caught up with John's imagery of the bride and the bridegroom, and sometimes his use of rather explicit language of romance between two lovers. Don't let that become an obstacle. And I want to give you a little story which might help us to think beyond literalism. So Pope Francis, when he came to the United States, he was at the World Gathering of Families, and he gave a talk there. But he began his talk by telling a story about this little kid who came to Pope Francis and asked this question. He said, "What did God do before God created the world?" And Pope Francis admits that he was a little flummoxed by the question, and he thought for a little while, and then he merely said this. He said, "Before God created the world, God loved." And then Pope Francis says that this love was not an inward-looking love. It was not a love that was self-centered or even narcissistic, but this love flowed out. So creation is an expression of that love. And most centrally, the love of the first man and woman. The friendship, the companionship, marriage, right? This marital expression of God's love. And so, in all of Scripture, whenever in both the prophetic literature and in wisdom literature, whenever God wants to express the depth of God's love, the symbolism that is used is marriage, fidelity. So, the book of Hosea, for example, if you open the book of Ezekiel, you have how God picked up this little child, and this child grew, became mature, but when it became mature, it got enwrapped in its own self and forgot God. It should have really loved God, but it did not. It was a symbolism for Israel as the bridegroom of God, and Israel as the bride of God, and God is the bridegroom, and it's supposed to be a love relationship. And so when you have people like John of the Cross, or in the Bible, the Song of Songs, use that imagery. Remember, it's poetry. John is writing poetry for an experience that is difficult to describe. So, as we read some of his poetry, but I'm also going to introduce you to his other poems that do not use that imagery, and you will see that he writes otherwise as well. But the importance of not getting stuck in literalism, but giving into imagery and symbolism, that is critical as we read poetry. So use your own symbolism. If the bride and bridegroom symbolism doesn't work for you, use your own symbolism, create your own, because the Spirit of God can do within you what you do not expect. So that symbolism may come from God, or it's a symbolism that you might develop as you keep going. But do not reject John or reject what he's saying about the soul and her union with God because you get stuck with literalism. This is poetry. This is art, folks. But art that leads to something deeply spiritual, and art that emerges for something deeply spiritual. It's a deep experience of John's union with God. So I hope that you've tried the 2 methods of prayer that I sent you, and I'll be very interested in knowing how you responded to the 2 methods of prayer. So if you want to communicate with me either via email or later through social media, please do. So then you have received quite an amount of reading material from us, and I'm going to ask you now to turn your page to the writings of John of the Cross. Folks, this is not a complete list. However, this list gives us his major works. Now, the reason that 3 poems, The Dark Night of the Soul, and the treatise assigned with it, Ascent to Mount Carmel, the Spiritual Canticle, and the Living Flame of Love. The reason why these poems are the ones that are most popular is because those are the ones for whom John wrote commentaries. And so that's why these works are more prominent, but that does not mean that that's all he wrote. So let's do a survey of his writings. So the page where it says the writings of John of the Cross, you can see that he wrote while he was in the Toledo prison for 9 months. This is in 1578. So he writes the Spiritual Canticle. The Spiritual Canticle, we are not going to deal with all of it, but just a few stanzas towards the end. But if you read the whole thing, it's unimaginable that in his darkest moment, he has such illumination. He has such clarity of the light. He has such deep experience of what it means for the soul to be in union with God. It truly is amazing. So you have the Spiritual Canticle, which is 31 stanzas, but then he added 8 others to it later. And then we are going to read this poem, For I Know Well the Spring, which is a poem. Again, he writes that from the prison, and I will tell you the context of that in a little bit. And then you have the romances, or the poem on the gospel text, In the beginning was the Word. Now, by the way, a lot of this work is available in our public libraries or also on the internet, so it may not be a bad exercise this week to look at some of this. And by the way, his poetry, when he writes the commentary on it, it's very complicated. But the poetry itself, the poems themselves, the language is very accessible. And so it would be good to read some of these poems. And then you have the Super Flumna Babylonis, or a poem on the psalm by the waters of Babylon, Psalm 137. This is the people of exile in Babylon, the people of Israel in exile in Babylon. So you have that Psalm 137. So then after his escape from Calvario, from Beza and Beza, you have the Dark Night, the poem that he writes. And then the sketch of Mount Carmel, which now is his commentary on the Dark Night. And there are 2 commentaries on the Dark Night. We'll come to that in a little bit. But then the sketch of the Mount and the Ascent to Mount Carmel, they're really commentaries on the Dark Night. And then you have the sayings of light and love, which I gave to you 2 weeks back. Remember, there were 175 sayings, which I had asked you to read a few a day. And so that's just little pieces of paper on which he would write notes for the people he was giving spiritual direction to. And there are counsels to a religious, as in monks and sisters. And then you have the Ascent to Mount Carmel, the treatise, which is a commentary on the Dark Night. And then you have the additions to the Spiritual Canticle. Remember, in the prison he wrote 31 stanzas, sorry, not verses, 31 stanzas. And then he adds 8 more to the 31. And then you have from Granada, he's writing from 1582 to 88, commentary on the Spiritual Canticle. So he wrote the poem, but now he's writing, and many of these commentaries he wrote because people were requesting him to write an explanation for his work. And so he would do it because he really desired to help people get their souls to the place where they could be in union with God. Nothing hurt him more than people floundering spiritually. And so he would write it for them. Then he writes the commentary on the Dark Night. Then we have the last poems in Granada. Again, those are the ones that we are saying that we will not reflect on too much, but I want you to know they exist. And then, of course, you have the Living Flame of Love commentary in a first redaction, and the Spiritual Canticle commentary in a second redaction. Towards the end, before he dies, he writes the Living Flame, and that's the one that is 4 stanzas, sorry, I keep saying verses, but it's stanzas, 4 stanzas. And we will reflect on each one of those stanzas in the next 4 weeks. That'll take us to the depth of his experience now, and the height of his experience. The other poems, it is very difficult for us to go into details because this is an 8-week series, and I don't think we have the capacity to do that. But I thought that at least we'll end on the note that John himself ended. Okay, so that's a survey of his literature, of his writings. But then I want you to move to this picture of the crucifix that I sent you amidst and it's the Christ crucified, a drawing by St. John of the Cross. Now the story goes that when John was chaplain at the monastery at the Incarnation in Avila, somewhere between 1574 and 1577, he was praying in a loft overlooking the sanctuary. And suddenly he received a vision. And he sketched it on a small piece of paper. And that's what this is. This picture of the crucifixion is. And it's a very different angle, isn't it? And I have the explanation there for you, so you may want to read that with me. The sketches of Christ crucified, suspended from the cross as if hanging in space, leaning forward toward his people. Look at that, huh? He's hanging in space, leaning toward his people. This cross is erect, and the lifeless and twisted body of Christ hangs forward with his hands hanging forward. Like his hands are pulling him forward. The corpus is held only by nails. The angle is from above. From the perspective God the Father would view it. So this is what, of course, we think of God being spatially up. And so this is how God would see Jesus hanging from the cross. He's weighed down by the sins of the world, yet leaning toward the world for which he died. So I am going to propose that this image becomes the object of your meditation in the coming weeks. And I want to keep all that I want you to keep all that explanation in prayer. Take just one part of it. Yeah, leaning towards his people. Leaning towards, even in death, he was leaning towards his people. He's leaning towards me. He's leaning towards my soul. God is constantly longing to be in union with the soul. And so reflect, pray about this. As I said, this could be an object of our prayer, meditation, and contemplation. Now, I'm not sure if you, this is the picture that I want you to see on the screen. And John's picture you see on the side there in the circle, but then the great Spanish painter, Salvador Dali, he took John of the Cross's image, and then this is the famous image that Salvador Dali became very popular for. He has a lot of other paintings as well, but Christ hanging from the cross. In fact, it was a project that was given to 2 Spanish artists, and Salvador Dali is the one who did this one, and this is a very popular one, so I wanted to make sure that you realize where it comes from. It comes from John of the Cross. And again, this is not part of his literature, but I wanted you to understand that John was not just a poet. He was just not a writer. He was an artist. And his imagination and his understanding of scripture, of God's involvement in the world, and God's thirst for this human soul, and the desire of the human soul to rise to God is all captured in art, whether it is his poetry or his drawings, his sketches. We won't dwell too much on the sayings of light and love, folks. That's the next sheet of paper that I would like you to turn to. On the top, it should say the sayings of light and love. So while he was a spiritual director in Avila, and before he had written other major works, John wrote down many of the thoughts and counsels for those he was guiding in spiritual direction. And after he returned from his imprisonment in Toledo, he continued spiritual direction in Andalusia, and he condensed many of his thoughts into concise spiritual counsels for his for his directees. So the sayings of light and love comes from his own writing. These are his own words. So there are 175 sayings, and I've just picked a few of them that I thought would be interesting. At least I found them interesting the week that I was doing this exercise with you of picking one, keeping it in my mind all day. So look at this one. It is better to be burdened and in company with the strong than to be unburdened and with the weak. When you are burdened, you're close to God, your strength who abides with the afflicted. How many times have we sung the hymn in church, or we've heard the psalm read, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. The Lord hears the cry of the poor," right? Why? Because when we are burdened, we are close to God and God is close to us. It's like Jesus on the cross. When Jesus felt most abandoned by God was the moment when God was closest to him. That was when the resurrection was the closest, isn't it? And so John says, when you are relieved of the burden, you are close to yourself, your own weakness. For virtue and strength of soul grow and are confirmed in the trials of patience. I thought it's a very deep thought. And then the second one, God desires the smallest degree of purity of conscience in you more than all the works you can perform. Something to think about. When fixed on something else, one's appetite leaves no room for the angel to move it. Next one, those who trust in themselves are worse than the devil. How many times have you said, the devil made me do it? John says, those who trust in themselves are worse than the devil. Those who do not love their neighbor abhor God. Great reminder for us during these times when everything seems so filled with hate and nastiness. Those who do not love their neighbor abhor God. Here is a very powerful one. Again, this can go back to the letter of St. James. Conquering the tongue is better than fasting on bread and water. By the way, fasting on bread and water was a very common act of penance among the monks. And conquering the tongue is better than fasting on bread and water. Suffering for God is better than working miracles. What does anyone know who doesn't know how to suffer for Christ? So that's the sayings of light and love. Again, you have that piece of literature with you. So if you would like to go back to return to that during the coming week, that would be helpful for you as well. So now I'm going to deal with one of his other works of art, his sketch, and it's called The Ascent to Mount Carmel. Now, 3 components make up the ascent to Mount Carmel. Okay? First of all, the sketch of the mount to perfection. So you should see this sketch. And I suggest that you don't keep it vertical, keep it horizontal. So we can access it better, but I'm going to access it with you in a minute. So the ascent to Mount Carmel, there are 3 components that make this work, Ascent to Mount Carmel. First of all, the sketch of the Mount of Perfection. That's what this is, that I showed you. Then you have the poem, The Dark Night. And then you have the treatise on the above 2, which is called The Ascent to Mount Carmel. So it is based on a commentary on his poem, The Dark Night. Based on this poem, The Dark Night, he would write another commentary for a completely different purpose. And that work is simply called The Dark Night. We'll come to that in a little bit. So first, let us deal with the sketch. Let us deal with the sketch of the Mount to Perfection. So if you will hold it sideways, see that there are 3 narrow paths that take you to the mountain. The middle one says the path of Mount Carmel and the perfect spirit, but above that it says the way of the imperfect spirit and the way of the imperfect spirit. Now both of these refer to goods of heaven and goods of earth. right? So the goods of heaven you see up there, where the top way of the imperfect spirit leads to. Goods of heaven: glory, joy, knowledge, consolation, rest. And at the bottom, the way of the imperfect spirit, goods of the earth: possessions, joy, knowledge, consolation. Now consolation, here could the consolation that we get from our regular interactions with each other, or even with beauty, and rest, right? So then let's go to the left-hand side column, where you have much of the stuff written sideways, right? And see what he says. To reach satisfaction in all, desire satisfaction in nothing. To come to the knowledge of all, desire the knowledge of nothing. To come to possess all, desire the possession of nothing. To arrive at being all, desire to be nothing. To come to enjoy what you have not, you must go by way in which you enjoy not. To come to the knowledge you have not, you must go by a way in which you know not. To come to the possession you have not, you must go by a way in which you possess not. To come to be what you are not, you must go by a way in which you are not. In many ways, can you think of John the Baptist, of how he says, he must increase and I must decrease? In other words, really reaching the perfection that the soul desires, it's almost like becoming nothing, so that God becomes everything. Let's continue. When you delay in something, you cease to rush toward the all. To go from the all to the all, you must deny yourself of all in all. And when you come to the possession of the all, you must possess it without wanting anything. And as we deal with his poems, we will get an explanation of a little more of this. However, the last section, he says, in this nakedness, the spirit finds its quietude and rest. For in coveting nothing, nothing tries it. By pulling it up, and nothing oppresses it. By pushing it down, because it is in the center of its humility. In this nakedness of the spirit, in this nakedness, the spirit finds its quietude and rest. For in coveting nothing, nothing tries it. By pulling it up, for in coveting nothing, nothing tires it by pulling it up. Sorry, I was reading the wrong word. For in coveting nothing, nothing tries it by pulling it up, and nothing oppresses it by pushing it down, because it is in the center of its humility. Now, the sketch of the Mount of Perfection shows in the middle a noticeably narrow path, right? That ascends to the circular expanse. So that entire expanse, if you're holding the paper sideways, horizontally, on the right-hand side, this entire circular path of freedom and fruitfulness, where only the honor and glory of God dwells. So he says that only the honor and glory of God dwells on this mountain. Now the path to that, the summit, is called, of course he's writing in Spanish, right? So he calls it nada. You've heard that word many times before, nada. So see the bottom, it says nothing, 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 and even on the mount, nothing. Now if you look above that, above the narrow path, it says, now that I no longer desire them, I have them all without desire. What is that? The goods of heaven: glory, joy, knowledge, consolation, rest, peace, joy, happiness, delight, wisdom, justice, fortitude, charity. Now that I desire them, I have them all without desire. A reading of the Ascent to Mount Carmel reveals more about this path. Now, this is also called the dark night, which is the way of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Now it finally becomes clear that this path is the narrow gate and the constricted road that leads to eternity. Where have you heard that? Where have you heard that? You've heard that in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, do not choose the broad path, but enter through the narrow gate. The Sermon on the Mount is the narrow gate. And all of the Sermon on the Mount, folks, is really a way of purifying ourselves, purify our soul. Now imagine how many times Jesus said, love your enemies. And that's the path where you desire nothing. That's the path of humility that John is talking about, right? In this nakedness, the spirit finds its quietude and rest. For in coveting nothing, nothing tries it by pulling it up, and nothing oppresses it by pushing it down, because it is in the center of its humility. Don't judge. Give, and more will be given to you. Right? So in desiring nothing, you have it all. So this paradox of the gospel is really the ascent of Mount Carmel. Now, around the words, only the honor and glory of God dwells on this mount, you have the words of Jeremiah, chapter 2, verse 7, which was Jeremiah's words to the people of his time. And God speaking to the Israelites, saying that he brought them into this land. What does he say? I brought you into the land of Carmel to eat its fruit and its good things. A land flowing with milk and honey. But of course the people choose not to eat what God gave them. But they went their own way, worshiping other gods. That's Jeremiah's prophecy in that verse. So John of the Cross connects the Old Testament, the New Testament. I told you last time, he was so familiar with the Bible, and not just any parts of the Bible, but all of Scripture, that he could use all of those symbolisms and apply it to those he was directing in his role as a spiritual director. So this is the ascent to Mount Carmel, and there's something else I want to point you out. At the edge of the Mount Carmel, see on the top it says, glory matters nothing to me. And the bottom it says, suffering matters nothing to me. And I wonder whether that's what was going on in the prison in Toledo. He suffered, and of course he escaped as well. But he suffered, but in that suffering, he's on a journey that's just simply inexplicable, undescribable. An amazing journey within himself. And look at his work finally, and look at the thought. Now all of this, in the ascent to Mount Carmel, he does not detail every one of this diagram, but then the sketch. But then if you read, it's a thick piece of work. The treatise that he had. So okay, let me then now at this point keep this picture in front of you, and I would like us to go to his poem, The Dark Night, which accompanies this sketch, and then I'll explain that a little bit. So keep that Dark Night in front of you, but let me just say a few words about it. John wrote The Dark Night while in his time of his affliction in imprisonment. And the stanzas of the poem resonate with the symbol of night and dark night. And this figure, first of all, is John's own experience of darkness. Remember, he was in this very dark cell with very little ventilation. And so he uses that experience of the night. And in the scriptures and in the writings of the fathers, darkness and light are very prominent themes. Right? Even John uses the symbolism of light. That Jesus himself says, I am the light of the world. And so he uses this darkness and light to to symbolize the movement of the soul towards union with God. So on the one hand, it's his own experience of darkness and abandonment in Toledo. On the other hand, it represents his purification, both in the senses and spiritual purification. And he calls it the dark night, because this process of purification is difficult. It's like the experience of his imprisonment in prison. So this poem consists of 8 stanzas, each having 5 verses. So let's go through that. The poem speaks of an escape at night. One dark night, fired with love's urgent longings, ah, sheer grace, I went out unseen, my house being now all stilled. Remember, he's calling that dark night sheer grace. I'll come to that at some point. For John, darkness is not darkness. It's a very active moment of the soul's journey. It's difficult, but it's grace. One dark night, fired with love's urgent longings, ah, sheer grace, I went out unseen, my house being now all stilled. In darkness and secure by the secret ladder disguised, ah, sheer grace. In darkness and concealment, my house being now all stilled. So the first speaks of an escape at night. This is the soul on a journey. Then it speaks of the wonders of that night as a guide and means. This is verses 3 to 5. On that glad night in secret, for no one saw me, nor did I look at anything, with no other light or guide than the one that burned in my heart. This guided me more surely than the light of noon to where he was awaiting me. Him I knew so well. There in a place where no one appeared. O guiding night, O night more lovely than the dawn, O night that has united the lover with his beloved, transforming the beloved in her lover. That's the soul and God, the bride and the bridegroom. And then finally in stanzas 6 and 8, the actual communion with the beloved realized that night. Upon my flowering breast, which I kept wholly for him alone, there he lay sleeping, and I caressing him, there in a breeze from the fanning cedars. When the breeze blew from the turret, as I parted his hair, it wounded my neck with its gentle hand, suspending all my senses. This is the spiritual union. Stanza 8. I abandoned and forgot myself, laying my face on my beloved. All things ceased. I went out from myself, leaving my cares forgotten among the lilies. So this poem, The Dark Night, it describes how God purifies the soul. Now, there are two ways in which the soul is purified. I remember talking about that last week. The active steps that the soul takes, that the human person takes in moving towards God. And then there is what God does to the soul, which is the passive purification. The ascent to Mount Carmel is really the active part of that purification. When the soul is trying to reach towards God, and the dark night is in reference to everything that the person does, the soul does, to detach itself and to purify itself to be worthy of this union with God. Now, John wrote this work, the treatise, the poem he wrote in prison, But then he wrote the treatise, the commentary on the poem, after he escaped. And at this point, he had an experience of the soul's union with God, deep, consummating union with God. And he did this having climbed through the active and passive phases of purification. And now he has experienced what it means to be on the top of the mountain of glory, of God's glory. But from here, he has the view of the path which he took, right? So he's able to see with so much clarity how to get to this place of deep intimacy with God. So he writes about it. His excellent view from the summit prompts him to write. And he wrote because he felt compelled to encourage people who were struggling and people who are on the journey. John really felt a lot of sadness at seeing many who failed to progress on this journey. Sometimes it's because we don't want to go through the darkness. Sometimes because we don't know how to go through the darkness. Or sometimes we don't want to embrace what this entails. I'm one of those people who tries to live a healthy life in terms of my eating and how I work out. If you want to maintain a healthy life, there are times you got to say no to things, right? And there are times you got to take active steps. So every other day, I work out for about 45, 50 minutes. And one of the things that I have to work out on is my elliptical machine. And this darn thing is broken. And it's not broken, but it's stuck on the highest resistance. So my elliptical machine is stuck on the highest resistance. And so from the time I get on it, man, it takes everything in me to get going. And I do that for about 35 minutes. It takes me 35 minutes to do the 5 kilometers. And then I pick up my weights and I do some weights and part yoga and part all that stuff. Believe me, when I started, I dread it because that's 15 minutes of sheer exhaustion. But then when I'm done with it, it feels wonderful. And then along with that, if you eat healthy, you feel that your body is in good shape. But many people struggle with that, isn't it? Now, for those who have reached that point where they feel healthy, I want to share that knowledge with other people who may feel unhealthy or who want to get on that path but don't know how. So the analogy that I'm giving is something that John was doing. As he writes this treatise, he's really trying to people who are spiritually trying to make it or finding it hard to embrace what it takes to make it there. This whole question of the dark night, the suffering, this is quintessential Christianity. If you attended the daily mass today, the scripture reading was about Jesus saying how he must suffer, that he must be killed, and then he would be raised on the third day. It's quintessential Christianity. There's no other way. There's no way to heaven without the cross. And our journey, our life, is symbolic of Christ's life. And so actively, we do everything that we can do to purify ourselves to be one with God in heaven. Isn't that what our journey is all about? So John wants to encourage, to comfort what he has learned, and must explain that God alone brings one to the summit. We can do some things, but finally God does things to us, and only God brings us to the top of the mountain. Joys, afflictions, hopes, and sorrows, these all accompany the journey with God. So this treatise has 3 books. The first book has 6 chapters. The second book has 32 chapters. And the third book has 45 chapters. Now you know why I did not want to go through the entire treatise. Okay, this is and it's very dense. But I just want to let you know that the Ascent to Mount Carmel and the treatise, the Ascent to Mount Carmel, are part of the poem that he writes. Now, this poem, Dark Night, which we read together, has a second commentary, and it's called The Dark Night as well. This Dark Night, the commentary, not the poem, the commentary, that has come to us as a separate manuscript than the Ascent to Mount Carmel. So one poem, two commentaries. First commentary, Ascent to Mount Carmel. Second commentary is called The Dark Night. And in this commentary, John talks about the passive night, or the passive process of purification. Active purification is what we do to get closer to God. The passive purification is what God does to us. The dark night of the soul, for example, when you don't feel any consolation from prayer, when you feel weary in prayer, right? You sit there for 15 minutes and you feel nothing, and you feel you wasted your time. That's all God passively working on you. And so John tries to pay attention to, because these are the two obstacles before we get to this deeper union with God. So the Dark Night, which is both the name of the poem and the treatise, in this John describes how God purifies the soul passively and brings the theological life, faith, hope, charity, to fruition. So these two works have to go together as we if you want to read them. The Dark Night is divided into book 1 and book 2. The first book consists of 14 chapters and explains the passive night of the senses. And the second book consists of 25 chapters, and it focuses on the passive night of the spirit. So God does things to both the senses and to the spirit. Passively, the human person goes through that. But the work of purification does require the active cooperation of the seeker. So the fact is that I need to be available for God to work passively in me. It's not like God does that by violating our freedom. It's really not. So we actively try to reach God, and then God actively tries to do things in us that is beyond the realm of human effort. Okay? So those are the two big works that I have for you to discuss, and I will do a little bit on the Canticle. However, before we go there are two pieces of his writings that I want us to just read, just for the sake of enjoying poetry. So if you will go to the page where we say, I live but not in myself, the heading for that is Stanzas of the Soul That Suffers with Longing to See God. That says it all, isn't it? Stanzas of the soul that suffers with longing to see God. And he's titled it, I live but not in myself. 8 stanzas. Let's read that. I live but not in myself, and I have such hope that I die because I do not die. I no longer live within myself, and I cannot live without God. For having neither him nor myself, what will life be? It'll be 1,000 deaths, longing for my true life, and dying because I do not die. This is the soul speaking, right? This life that I live is no life at all. So I die continually until I live with you. Hear me, my God. I do not desire this life. I am dying because I do not die. Remember Paul wanting to be with God, but this is last Sunday's readings. Paul says, for I desire, I want to be with the Lord, but I'm going to be here for the sake of the community, the Philippian community, right? It's something very similar that John is saying over here. Hear me, my God, I do not desire this life. I'm dying because I do not die. The soul wants to be in union with God, but the soul can only be in total union with God when we die. This beatific vision. So it says, I do not desire this life, and I'm dying because I do not die. When I'm away from you, what life can I have except to endure the bitterest death known? I pity myself, for I go on and on living, dying because I do not die. So it's like living this life is a dying. A fish that leaves the water has this relief: the dying it endures ends at last in death. What death can equal my pitiable life? For the longer I live, the more drawn out is my dying. When I try to find relief, seeing you in the sacrament, I find this great sorrow. I cannot enjoy you wholly. All things are affliction, since I do not see you as I desire, and I die because I do not die. And if I rejoice, Lord, in the hope of seeing you, yet seeing I can lose you doubles my sorrow. Living in such fear and hoping as I hope, I die because I do not die. Lift me from this death. There is a typo there, it's not life, but lift. Lift me from this death, my God, and give me life. Do not hold me bound with these strong bonds so strong. See how I long to see you. My wretchedness is so complete that I die because I do not die. I will cry out for death and mourn my living while I am held here for my sins. Oh my God, when will it be that I can truly say, now I live because I do not die? I was making reference earlier to the Platonic and Augustinian kind of philosophical and theological thought. That last paragraph, bingo. I will cry out for death and mourn my living while I'm held here for my sins. The soul is kind of, imprisoned in the body kind of feeling. My God, when will it be that I can truly say, now I live because I do not die, because once the soul is one with God, it is eternal. Beautiful, isn't it? Again, these are poems that you could make part of your prayer this coming week. Reflect upon it, pray upon it. So the next one is, it's called La Fonte, and again in Spanish, but it's for I know well the spring, the font, the spring. Song of the soul that rejoices in knowing God through faith. For I know well the spring that flows and runs, although it is night. That eternal spring is hidden, for I know well where it has its rise, although it's night. Just an aside. He wrote this in the prison in Toledo. And at some point I would like you to go and search on the internet to the prison and the monastery where John was housed in Toledo. Now that the original building does not exist. But the prison and the monastery was very close to the river. And John could hear the sound of the river all day, all night. Especially when he was in the night, in his cell, it was all dark. But what he could hear was the flowing of the river. Sometimes little, sometimes a lot. But this poem kind of emerges from his darkness, and yet the image that flows is a very positive image of a God, Jesus, the living waters. So that eternal spring is hidden, for I know well where it has its rise, although it is night. I do not know its origin, nor has it one, but I know that every origin has come from it, although it is night. I know that nothing else is so beautiful, and that the heaven and the earth drink there, although it is night. I know well that it is bottomless, and no one is able to cross it, although it's night. Its clarity is never darkened, and I know that every light has come from it, although it is night. I know that its streams are so brimming, they water the lands of hell, the heavens and earth, although it is night. I know well the stream that flows from the spring is mighty in compass and power, although it is night. I know the stream proceeding from these two, that neither of them in fact precedes it, although it is night. This eternal spring is hidden in this living bread for our life's sake, although it is night. It is here calling out to creatures, and they satisfy their thirst, although in darkness, because it is night. This living spring that I long for, I see in this bread of life, although it is night. The reference to the bread of life is the Eucharist. Okay, so, bride and bridegroom is not all that John wrote about. There's a lot more to his writing, and I wanted to introduce to that part of his writing that is not necessarily about the union, but the experience of darkness, yet within that darkness finding deep meaning and light and life. So then we have the other very popular work of John of the Cross, the Spiritual Canticle, and this is the last one we'll deal with. Again, the reason why it is very popular is because there is an entire commentary that he writes on it. And there are 40 verses to this. Again, I keep saying verses, 40 stanzas to it. And it does not explicitly mention Christ, but the poem is about a loving exchange between a soul and Christ the bridegroom. The language is very much that of the Song of Songs. The soul represents John, and the stanzas are the conversation of love that must have occurred between himself and Christ. The stanzas are utterances of love flowing from a mystical understanding. So remember that higher level of contemplation I was talking about, right? There is contemplation where our feet are still on the ground, but there's this higher level of, this is explanation of that. Again, it's poetry, it's art. Don't get caught in the literalism of the language that he uses of the bride and the bridegroom, of romance, of love. Don't get caught. You create your own symbolism. But this is John, and I just have a few verses, few stanzas that I want us to just get a taste of the Spiritual Canticle. Again, it's available on the internet. You can go and take a look at it and read the entire thing during this week. And this is in the form of a dialogue between the bride and the bridegroom. Let's just read that. Where have you hidden, beloved, and left me mourning? You fled like the stag after wounding me. I went out calling you, but you were gone. Now remember, he wrote 31 verses of this while he was in prison. So he's feeling the darkness. That first verse talks about the darkness. Where have you hidden, beloved, and left me mourning? You fled like a stag after wounding me. I went out calling you, but you were gone. In verse 20, in stanza 22, the bride has entered the sweet garden of her desire, and she rests in delight, laying her neck on the gentle arms of her beloved. Beneath the apple tree that I took you for my own, that I offered you my hand and restored you where your mother was corrupted. This is a reference to the Garden of Eden, The bride says, do not despise me. This is stanza 33. Do not despise me, for if before you found me dark, now truly you can look at me, since you have looked and left me in grace and beauty. So he's moved beyond the darkness. The bridegroom, stanza 35. She lived in solitude, and now in solitude has built her nest. And in solitude he guides her. He alone who also bears in solitude the wound of love. 36, 37, 38, 39 talk about the union. Let us rejoice, O my beloved. Let us go forth to see ourselves in your beauty. To the mountain and the hill where the pure water flows, let us enter into the heart of the thicket. We shall go at once to the deep caverns of the rock, which are all secret. There we shall enter in and taste of the new wine of the pomegranate. There you will show me that which my soul desired. And there you will give at once, O you, my life, that which you gave me the other day. The breathing of the air, the song of the sweet nightingale, the grove and its living beauty in the serene night, with the flame that is consuming and painless. With the flame that is consuming and painless, the living flame of love. That's the last piece, the last poem that he wrote, and that is where we are heading in the coming 4 weeks. So, as I read this spiritual canticle, I'm hurting because I did not want to read all the 40 verses, 40 stanzas today. I just give a sample of the beginning, the darkness, the part where there is enlightenment, illumination, and finally the part from 36 to 39, where there is the union of the bride and the groom. But please, again, take a look at the internet, or you can go to the library, and you can find the entire spiritual canticle and the treatise that goes with it. That brings us to the conclusion for today. As I said, this is just a brief survey of the writings of John of the Cross. Just a taste. Again, may I suggest to you, do not feel discouraged. And if you do, it's part of the process. Do not try to be John of the Cross. In all of this that we have learned, I think we are paying attention to this life within us, the soul that God has placed within us. The soul one day, using the path that John lays, nada, 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 everything is nothing, so that we find everything, right? Is a journey that we are on, and this journey is of the senses, of the spirit. It's active, it's passive efforts that we make and God makes in us, all that leads us and prepares us for that ultimate union with God, the beatific vision in heaven. John is saying that our dying is our rising. It's when we die that we truly live in God. And so our living is actually our dying, and our dying is actually our living. We try to die to ourselves in our senses and in our spirit, and allow God to do what God can do, so that we may be no more and the soul can be all in God. This is the ascent to Mount Carmel. I pray and hope that you do not get discouraged, but that you understand the deeper movements and the process that John is pointing us towards, to pay attention to the soul that sometimes is breathless within us. Let's give our soul the breath of God, the light of God, the life of God. God bless you, and have a good night.